Hello, uh, welcome to the 21st module of the course in Applied Linguistics, which is a part of the UGC E-Pathshala program in linguistics. If you remember, throughout this course at various places, we have talked about the theory of interference, and we have said that it holds great influence, maintains great influence on language teachers. They often say, look, this thing does not exist in the L1. How can this person acquire it in L2? So there is this sort of constant reference to L1 as an obstacle to the acquisition of L2. And we have briefly argued against this. But in this unit, we would like to examine the theory of interference and the contrastive analysis which follows from it in little more detail. And we will give you examples from the level of sounds, that means the phonological level. We'll give you examples from the level of words, that means the morphological level. And we'll also try to give you examples from the level of syntax, that means the syntactic level. The most important thing, the most important claim I should say about contrastive analysis since Lado's famous work in 1957 has been that it has a very high predictive value. And if you look at your screen, there is this quotation by Robert Lado, 1957, that we can predict and describe the patterns that will cause difficulty in learning. So the claim is that the teachers will already know, the teacher trainers will already know what in the good old DPEP days, District Primary Education Program in the 1990s and so on, came to be known as the hard spots. So when we used to go to the workshops, we asked, what would you like? Sir, please talk about the hard spots. So hard spots was the focus, and this we think is a very destructive approach to the whole enterprise of education and of language teaching, that you are constantly trying to fix, the problem areas. You are constantly trying. Your focus is on what we earlier called pathologies, that something is wrong. You do not want to see, for example, in the case of a child who has said she walked to college every day, you do not wish to see that the word order is right. You do not see that the adverbial is correct every day and it is in the right place. And it is not college to every day, but it is to college every day. The preposition comes before college and not after that. I think this is our approach should be to see what the child has acquired rather than on what the child has not acquired. The reason being that what has been acquired, as I'll try to show as we go along, tells you a lot more about language acquisition and about learning strategies of children than trying to focus your attention on a few quote-unquote mistakes, errors, deviations, and so on. But Lado believed that we can predict these and that those that will not cause difficulty by comparing systematically the structure of L1 and L2. We can, their language structures and their cultural background of L1 and L2, we can make a fair amount of prediction. And if you now see on your screen a very interesting sort of picture which summarizes the L1, L2 comparison. This slide is on your screen at the moment, and you can see that on one side is L1, other side is L2, and there are sort of 8 categories, 3 of the easy ones, 3 of the sort of intermediate level, they are difficult areas, and 2 which would prove to be extremely difficult. Okay. So the areas, it was predicted by contrastive analysis and the theory of interference that if there is a language overlap in L1 and L2, that something which is obligatory in L1 is also obligatory in L2. Let us say the subject comes first and the verb comes in the end, or that there is an agreement between the subject and the verb in both the languages in all possible ways. Then, or let us say there are 3 pronouns in L1 and 3 pronouns in L2, so there is an overlap. So these things are obligatory. If something is obligatory in L1 and it is also obligatory in L2, it will cause no problem. That is what A says in the easy area. Similarly, if something is optional in L1 and it is also optional in L2, for example, if Hindi is the L1, then the pro drop is optional. You can say मैं जाऊं or you can say जाऊं. You can say both. You can say मोहन खाना खा रहा है और वह खाना खा रहा है, and then you can drop वह and you can say खा रहा है, which can only mean खा रहा है. Or if you say खा रहा हूँ ना, खा रहा हूँ, that means only मैं and masculine and singular. Okay, so that is optional. Now imagine an L2 which is also pro drop, where the pronoun can be dropped. That means it will be easy to learn. That was the prediction. And if there is something obligatory in L1 but does not exist in L2, that will also not cause any problems. That was the prediction. On the other hand, the difficult area was if there was something optional in L1 but it did not exist in L2, that will cause a problem. And if there was something obligatory in L1 but becomes optional in L2, that will cause problems. And if there was something optional in L1 but obligatory in L2, that is likely to cause a problem. So these were the problems. But the greatest problem would be caused by the kind of situations when you have L1 and L2 that it is 0. As you can see on your screen, it is neither optional nor obligatory, it just doesn't exist. So either it is optional in L2 or it is obligatory in L2. These two situations, when the phenomena doesn't exist at all in L1, if your L1 is Hindi, then it is obligatory to always make an agreement between the subject and the verb. So we have been giving examples. वह खाता है, मैं खाता हूँ, तुम खाते हो. So the verb changes according to the subject, but not in English. In English, it is he, she walks. Other than that, everybody walk. I walk, you walk, we walk, they walk. So it doesn't. The agreement is not that strong. Okay, as it's not as explicit and as frequently copied from the subject to the verb as it is in Hindi. So if it is that kind of situation, then language learning for a Hindi speaker, for an English speaker as an L1, learning Hindi is going to be more difficult. And we will see more examples of that. See some examples. For example, it is not very straightforward that if it is there in both the languages, it may actually be there in very different ways. Look at the level of sounds. So there are sounds which you will know by now, like what are called plosives or what are called stop sounds, which are produced with an explosion like p or b. So English has 6 of them. 3 voiceless, 3 voiced. Pataka, badaga. That's all. There are 6 stops as opposed to Hindi, which has at least 20. And we'll talk about them very soon. But the point here is that the Hindi pa and the English pa are not the same. Okay, that's what we need to understand. Because when we look at it in terms of distribution, then pa ta ka, unlike the Hindi pa ta ka, will be aspirated. Normally, they are like the Hindi pa ta ka. For example, in a word like cup, whether you say it in Hindi or in English, the pa would be more or less the same. But in a word like pin, let us say if you were to say pin in both Hindi and English, so in Hindi you would say pin, but in English you have to say, in native speakers English, you have to say pin. So that pa in the stressed initial position has to be aspirated. So you have pin, tin, kin. We say time, but they say time. We will say tire, they'll say tire. So the t has to be aspirated. So learning, even though there is an overlap, learning another language is getting hold of nuances, very nuanced kind of sound systems, which are not easy to acquire, and which cannot be acquired through a theory of interference and through what we talked about earlier, the behaviorist paradigm of PPMM and reward and punishment. There is also the case of, which I talked about earlier also, the English interdental fricatives like f and g, and we have already talked about them earlier, and I don't wish to repeat them. And also the case of, let's say for a Hindi learner, the difference between the English v and w. Now, a contrastive analysis would predict that, because most Indian languages have only one sound, like w, right? So we will say wine and wine for V-I-N-E and for W-I-N-E. But an English speaker would say wine and wine. This also we have talked about earlier. So let's go to the case of the Hindi stops. So an English person or an English child trying to learn Hindi as a second language or as a third language. So if you see the chart, this slide is on your screen. It must be in front of you. I hope they will put it in front of your screen. That is, this slide is about a description of the 20 consonantal sounds of the Hindi language. And there are 4 in each category, from the lips to the velum. So, pa, ta, ka, ka, cha, ta, ta, pa. So, from here, ka, cha, ta, ta, pa. And then we have 3 more in each line. Now, if you need to distinguish 4 consonantal sounds, in each one they are distinguished in terms of place of articulation. Okay. Either it is teeth, behind the teeth. So, ta is like this. These are your teeth, and ta, ta, tha, da, dha, no, ta. Pa is here. Pa, pa, ba, bha, right? And then ta is like this. Ta, tha, da, dha, etc. So these are distinguished on that, the place where the consonantal sounds are articulated. But in terms, so all the pa sounds are the pavarg sound, the class of pa sounds are articulated at the lips. All the tavarg, the class of ta sounds is at the teeth. Ta, tha, da, dha, all the 4. So we need 2 more features in terms of binary features to distinguish them. And these are the features of aspiration and voicing. Aspiration, I explained to you earlier, is the extra puff of air, okay, which makes the distinction between p and p. So if you take a candle like this in front of you and you light a candle and you say p, nothing would happen. But if you say p, the candle will go off, or at least the flame will go like this. You can try this. So that is the difference. That is the only difference between p and p. There is a difference between p and b, because in the case of p, the vocal cords are not vibrating. In the case of b, they are vibrating. So they are called voice. So we need two features, aspiration and voicing. So p, as you can see on the screen, p is minus aspirate minus voice. P is plus aspirate minus voice. B is plus voice minus aspirate, but bh is plus aspirate and plus voice. Now imagine an English person, or any Western perhaps, is going to go crazy trying to learn all these distinctions. That is why if an Englishman trying to say ghar, he would say gar, because he knows g, the closest sound is g. So it's very difficult for him to pronounce ghar. Okay. However, the fact remains that it is not impossible to acquire these sounds. But contrastive analysis certainly tells us that these will be difficult. There is a comparison with pa, ta, ka and ba, da, ga, which are 6 in all. With these 20, makes it clear that it's going to be difficult for them to acquire it. So that's the world of sounds, and in the world of sounds, contrastive analysis is significantly helpful. It makes some sense to use contrastive analysis and learn something from it in terms of the theory of interference. But at the level of words, I think contrastive analysis cannot be of great use, because lexicon is a list of words that are related to each other differently in different languages. So they have to be learned. Okay. So very difficult to say. You can sort of say that a child will have problems learning ice and snow, because in Hindi she has only one word called barf, but ice and snow. Similarly, maybe in the Eskimo language there are 7 words for snow, so she will have to learn 7 words, etc. We can say that. But generally, in any language, a second language or a third language, you have to learn from the context and through other ways the words of the new language. And you have to learn very nuanced things. Ghar, there is a lot of difference in Hindi between ghar and makan. There is an overlap. Maybe in Hindi you can say, maine ghar kharida, maine makan kharida. That's okay. But in English language, you can say, I bought a house, but you don't normally say, I bought a home. So home and house, they look very close, but their collocations, their usage is very different. So you can talk of homecoming, you can talk of home brewed, you can talk of home truth, you can talk of homemade, these are homemade pickles. Or you can say homesickness, when you feel sick and therefore you want to go home. You don't want to go house, or you don't want to go to your house. You want to go home if you are feeling homesick. On the other hand, you have houseboat, housemaid, house surgeon, housewarming, etc. So the two words, home and house, which look so close otherwise, and may in many contexts in Hindi may be translated only as ghar, or maybe as makan, or some other word. But the collocational restrictions in English are very different and have to be learned. Similarly, if there are similar collocational restrictions in Hindi, they will have to be acquired. So at the level of words, Contrastive analysis is sort of, not of much use. But at the level of sentences, it tells us that contrastive analysis is almost useless. Uh, I pointed out earlier in one of the modules that one of the reasons that we may call it interference may be because the input from the teachers and the parents is what the child is speaking. It has nothing to do with the first language. If the teacher keeps saying, you are going to the market, isn't it? You are eating an apple, isn't it? I will be late tomorrow, isn't it? I mean, if every time he say, isn't it, because of Hannah, then the child is not saying it because of Hannah. The child is saying because that is her input, which is becoming intake from the parents and from the teachers and from the peer group. So in her case, there is no evidence that it could be interference if she were getting different input. If she were getting the input, you are going to the market, aren't you? You are eating an apple, aren't you? She is writing a letter, isn't she? That would be fine, but that's not the input that she is getting. Remember that in the case of syntax, the level of interference is so small. I mean, what is amazing is that there is so little interference. Children figure out the major syntactic pattern so easily and so quickly because that is so central to language acquisition. Consider the case of English and Hindi again. If you see that English is verb medial, so you say Ram ate an apple, whereas Hindi is verb final, so you say Ram ne seb khaya. But I have yet to see a child who will produce an English sentence which will say Ram an apple ate. That kind of mistake, that kind of error doesn't happen, so that children figure out very quickly, what is the basic syntactic structure of the target language. There are some very interesting examples which are on your screen now. This comes from Professor Jain, who used to be at IIT Delhi. Consider these examples which are on your screen and you can read them. Entry will be by tickets, or don't pull my legs, and he finished books after books. Now, many Indians would say that entry will be by tickets. Now, the right thing to say in English is to say entry will be by ticket, or don't pull my leg. But the point is that both leg and ticket and book can be made plural, and in this case there seems to be enough rational reason to make them plural, because many people are coming, all of them should be carrying tickets, so entry will be by tickets. Sounds perfect. But English language has this exception that in such cases it will use the singular rather than the plural. Okay? Don't pull my leg. Pull my leg is a kind of idiomatic expression which has stayed as pull my leg. If there could in principle be nothing wrong with don't pull my legs. Okay? Or for example, to defeat him is a child's play for me, or they only play a lip service to Islam. So that A, which is normally the general rule of English language is that you must have an article before a countable noun. Now, when the child is applying that rule, you have problems. Okay? He's saying, a lip service, but English would say pay lip service. Okay? So we should look at these errors in a sort of multi-dimensional space, and try to appreciate. I think the moral of the story is that let us try to appreciate what children have learned, not what they have not learned. What they have not learned, they will learn because they have already learned so much. They have learned that, for example, the syntactic structure, the correct order, more or less correct placement of the lexical item, more or less Correct. For example, saying tickets is evidence of, or saying legs is evidence of learning. Putting an article before a countable singular noun is evidence of learning. So let's give them credit for that. And over a period of time, when they are cognitively ready, when they have seen enough examples of similar kind, they will acquire the rest. So let us give them more exposure and more spaces and platform to read and to write and to speak rather than focus on what we say are errors or mistakes. Thank you very much.